Kenya seems to be going back to the International Monetary Fund hat in hand after the central bank governor said it was discussing getting more money from the fund via its existing loan program. The country is talking with the IMF about a possible augmentation of its loan program, potentially by asking the fund for exceptional access as it seeks to manage its debt, including a $2 billion Eurobond maturing in June 2024. Exceptional access will allow Kenya to ask for more than its limit of IMF funding. And if more IMF funds are approved, it would be the third increase to the loan program, which was originally set at $2.3 billion in 2021. Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst, as well as the CEO of Rich Management, joins me now. Welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me. All right, so I think you're muted. Just quickly help us check the audio there so we can get the conversation started.
It's a pleasure to speak with you as always. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So let's start with where East Africa's largest economy is finding itself right now. So what are the current economic challenges or financial needs for Kenya that are pushing it to seek more money from the IMF?
So I think, this is a symptom of a disease which many countries on the continent are experiencing. Kenya has a very high debt load, high interest payments related to that debt load, which is sucking up a lot of government revenue. We've got an inflation rate which is climbing. We've got, challenges all across the economy. And really, I think it's a 24-month hump that the government has got to get over. On top of that, we've seen a huge increase in taxes across the board, and really they're not achieving what they aim to do, which was collect more money, because there's been a sharp slowdown in collections, a sharp slowdown in VAT receipts, something that I think you've seen also in Nigeria, a sharp fall in fuel consumption, for example. So it's a perfect storm, and the Kenya government have turned to the IMF, which has been a friend for many years. Mr. Selassie, who's the head of the Africa department for the IMF, said we'll do whatever it takes to help Kenya. So I think Kenya is leaning on that and looking for extra funds, probably to the tune of $1 to $1.5 billion extra. And I suspect the IMF will support Kenya at this time.
So let's look at some of what the IMF and Kenya have done together. So we know the IMF Executive Board completed the 5th reviews under the EFF and ECF arrangements for Kenya in May of this year, and that allowed for an immediate disbursement equivalent to special drawing rights of some $306.7 million, about $415.4 million. So that also includes special drawing rights of $81.4 million for augmentation of access. The Executive Board also approved a 20-month arrangement under the Resilience and Sustainability Facility to support Kenya's very ambitious efforts to build resilience to climate change and even catalyze further private climate financing. Interesting enough, there's some key policy priorities, and you mentioned taxation being one of them, and that also includes reducing debt vulnerabilities through multi-year fiscal consolidation efforts, which involve the increase in tax revenue. So in terms of any progress being made when it comes to this multi-year fiscal consideration, has there been progress at all with what has been done so far with the IMF and Kenya?
So I think Kenya has very much followed the IMF's prescription. They've raised taxes, they've raised the VAT rate, they've allowed the shilling to find its real level. The shilling was previously being throttled by a lack of supply of dollars, and the rate was largely artificial. So, and on the tax front, as I said, the government has sought to implement the reforms that the IMF was suggesting. Big challenges which still are out there are the parastatals, for example, where the IMF is keen that the government gets on top of the debt issue in the parastatal sector. We haven't seen much progress on that front so far. But overall, I would say Kenya probably marks at 8 or 7.5 out of 10 versus what the IMF is looking for. And that's why you got such fulsome praise and such support out of Selassie, the Africa head of the IMF.
So, in terms of the key policy priorities for this Kenya IMF supported program, let's quickly look at those before we look further into this request. How are they expected to help the country sustain macroeconomic stability and market confidence, promote growth, and even advance ongoing reforms? As you're talking now, yes, Kenya has tried to align itself with everything that the IMF has asked, but there doesn't seem to have been as much progress as many of us would have hoped.
Well, I think, what the IMF is asking for is higher tax, a higher compliance, some kind of debt program, a management program over the medium term. I think, the problem with the tax scenario is the Laffer curve. You can tax people so much, and then eventually your tax collections start to go down because you're just squeezing a lemon too much. And I think Kenya is in that problem, that there's only so much tax you can squeeze from the country, and we're very close to the limit. In terms of debt management, I think Kenya has been managing its debt much better. It's been reducing expensive debt. It's been leaning harder on the likes of the World Bank and the IMF. Lower interest rates are attached to their loans. And I think over time, that's going to help Kenya get over this very critical 24-month period. And I think the IMF and the World Bank and bilateral partners are seeking to assist Kenya over this very, very critical period.
So we might call it money, we might call it funds, but at the end of the day, this is additional borrowing that is coming from the IMF. In terms of the effect on Kenya's national debt and overall fiscal sustainability, if the IMF does agree to this exceptional access, what kind of pressure does that put on the country's debt and fiscal position?
So what it does do, it does increase Kenya's debt to GDP ratio. Various estimates put it between 65 and 75%, depending upon how you calculate it. But where the IMF is very helpful is that the cost of money from the IMF tends to be very competitive. If you look at the Eurobond market, where Kenya is locked out at the moment, and part of this program, I think the Kenya government is seeking to allocate some of the funds the IMF will give them to retiring or buying back some of the debt that's coming up for redemption in 2024. And why this request is now mission critical is because of that redemption wall that's facing us. But overall, I think the IMF reduces the cost of borrowing, and therefore, whilst it's increasing the overall debt load, there is a meaningful reduction in the interest charge, and it's currently the interest payments that are putting a massive squeeze on our economy.
So let's talk about this exceptional access that Kenya is asking for. So if the IMF is to approve the funds, this would be the third increase to this loan program, which was originally set at $2.3 billion in 2021. You said earlier that you think the likelihood is that the IMF will grant the request, that the IMF does seem to want to work with Kenya in regards to this. But beyond that, what are we looking at in terms of money? You talked about it a bit, so I want us to dwell on it now. What are we looking at as Kenya's ask? And what could the IMF actually eventually approve? And also, do you expect to see more conditions being put on Kenya from the IMF in regards to extending and giving this exceptional access?
Okay, so a number of questions there. First, I think Kenya's ask is probably somewhere around $2 billion. I don't think they're going to get that, but I think that's what they're going to ask for. And why I say that is you've got a redemption of $2 billion. So clearly they're not going to apply all the money to that Eurobond redemption. But let's say they apply $1 billion, then you're left with another $1 billion. So I think that they're going to look to ask for about $2 billion. I suspect the IMF will come up with something between 750 million and $1 billion extra funds. But the fact that the IMF comes up with that money has a multiplier effect. It gives comfort to other lenders, and it confirms that Kenya is on an IMF program, which is something that a lot of other lenders would like to see, and that it's been a successful participant in the IMF program. So I expect between 750 and $1 billion, but that has a multiplier effect, and that it will crowd other people in. and hopefully similar lenders to the IMF who will be able to give Kenya attractive interest rates.
So all of these issues for Kenya and other African countries seem to come about because of domestic issues in terms of financing and being able to raise the funds. So for Kenya in particularly, is the country working on alternative strategies, domestic initiatives, whatever it can do to address these economic challenges without going back to relying heavily on external financial assistance? Are there efforts being made to internally boost the economy and attract investment? Because what we are seeing, this is Kenya, this is Ghana, this is Egypt now. It's just a cycle. It could be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. But these major African economies are finding themselves going back to the IMF once again to ask for more money. It's quiet, it's good for a few years, and then the cycle somehow repeats itself all over again. Are we fixing our internal economic issues?
So that's the ultimate question. I mean, are we going to be serious this time around? Because we certainly weren't serious last time around. We borrowed a ton of money. A lot of it was misspent, and now we're paying the debts on that money. So you're completely correct. We hope we don't repeat that cycle, but I can't speak for our policymakers. I think that's something that the IMF is probably holding their feet to the fire and saying, this time round we want to really see these reforms enacted. In Kenya's case, you raised the issue of, are we mobilizing money at home? Yes, we are. We're trying to. I think there's a diaspora bond, for example, that's being issued as we speak. That's being targeted towards the diaspora, very patriotic type prospectus, I noticed, which I found interesting. But, a lot of our countries borrowed a ton of cash in the local market. This became the panacea, the way forward in order to reduce reliance on international markets and international multilaterals, was to raise money from the local market. Now, the problem that's happened here is we stuffed our local institutions and banks up to the gills with these bonds. And now these bonds are seriously underperforming. As you know, what happened in Ghana was investors had to take a huge haircut. You have an inflation rate of about 35%, and investors had to take the principal amount in Ghana, I think, was left intact, but your coupon was 5%. So effectively, you're being hammered each year when you're getting 5% interest on where inflation is running above 30%. And what's happened is all our local institutions essentially have major issues, indigestion issues. They bought far too many bonds, they're at the wrong price, and they're sitting on their balance sheets. So in Kenya's case, Kenya's looking to reduce the amount of issuance in the local market to relieve some of the pressure on the local institutions and replace it with this kind of money from the IMF. That's the strategy, I believe.
Okay, so if there's a strategy in place, expectation that the IMF will agree to this exceptional access, what then is the expectation for Kenya's economic performance and stability after receiving this additional IMF support? How will the funds contribute to Kenya's long-term economic growth and stability? Do we also have a timeline involved in all of this, given that this Eurobond maturity of June 2024 seems to be the clock that's running down right now?
Yeah, so I think, at the moment, it's difficult to see the wood for the trees because you've got this tremendous pressure that the Eurobond is putting on the fiscus. I mean, you got other pressure, low tax receipts, interest payments, which are consuming 40 to 45% of government income. So right now, I think what the government's trying to do is steady the ship, get through the next 24 months, get through this very lumpy period, and hoping that we'll see sunny uplands on the other side and some kind of recovery. The economy has proven quite resilient. It's been growing at 5%, which is a good performance in the context of what we've been talking about. So there is some resilience in the economy, obviously. But I think we've got a 24-month period, which is going to be tough. Everyone's feeling it. People are complaining about it. But I think the president's administration is hoping that after that period, and in line with the electoral cycle, you'll start to see some relief in the economy and maybe some tax relief as well to allow the economy to grow faster and people to feel better.
And that's an important note there. In line with the electoral cycle, President William Ruto has not had it easy since he became president. And one of the things that has been noted now is that Kenya's total public debt rose by a record 1.56 trillion shillings. That's about $10.8 billion in the financial year ended June 30 to 10.1 trillion shillings. That's over $70 billion. Now, this breaches a debt ceiling of 10 trillion shillings. So, according to records, the increase in the public debt is attributed to external loan disbursements, exchange rate fluctuations, and the uptake of domestic and external debt. Just the conversation we're having now. So, loan repayment costs, mainly to China, have also shot up due to a weakened shilling. The cost of debt servicing in the year ended June was 391 billion shillings, of which the highest payments, 107, went to China. And as I mentioned, there's this $2 billion Eurobond maturing in June 2024 that is on the top of everybody's mind. Ali Khan, first question here, and I laid that groundwork because of how to see what Kenya's economy currently looks like. Does Kenya really have any other choice other than going back to the IMF to request for this exceptional access? Is there any other alternative in this situation with the clock running down to June 2024?
So the Eurobond market is shut to most African sovereign issuers, so forget that. You can't go there. Kenya has gone to China, at that BRI forum. I believe they pitched for about $1 billion and some maturity extension for the outstanding loans. That might be seen positively by China because Kenya has been quite religious in making sure payments have been made on time on its China debt related to the railway. Of course, some of the money that came in from the IMF and World Bank went to pay those Chinese debts, but the bottom line is Kenya has gone there as well. Then you've got the likes of the African Development Bank, which have been supportive and have a program. You have Afrexim Bank, but essentially those are the main countries. Kenya has also been well supported by this US administration, and I think there's a potential for some bilateral support. But I suspect the US will also be leaning hard on the IMF to come through on this request.
All right, finally, Ali Khan, in terms of debt restructuring, we've finally seen some very, very heartening progress with Zambia as it was considering the bondholders and the deals that we're looking at now. But as you said earlier, the head of the Africa department for the IMF is saying that Kenya is not possibly interested in restructuring. Do we need to completely take restructuring off the table for Kenya? Not even just Kenya. Look at the situation in Nigeria. We've seen what's going on in Ghana. I'm going to mention Egypt once again as well. We've seen finally progress being made in Zambia, but are we at a point where some of these major African economies need to be very, very honest and transparent that restructuring has to be a conversation on the table?
That's a very interesting point you're making there. I think, President Ruto himself, at least on 2 occasions, has spoken about restructuring, but the rest of the administration have said, look, it's just not going to happen. It's interesting in that sense that there are 2 voices addressing this issue seemingly in contradiction. I think essentially that what's really required across the continent is some kind of major continent-wide restructuring program, not much different to something like the Brady Plan, which was brought into Latin America in the 80s and 90s. So look, I think, it's a dirty word. People don't like to speak it because it normally sends off alarm bells, reduces your credit lines practically immediately when people hear that word. But yes, I agree with you. It's high time we had adult conversations on this point. Zambia has had a tremendous success in terms of renegotiating their outstanding debts. I'm very impressed with Hichilema's administration. It was herding cats. You had, all kinds of different constituents from Eurobond holders to China to others, and they managed to thread that needle. And also, interestingly, unlike Ghana, protected their local institutions by not exacting a haircut on local securities, which was an important reform. I was taken aback they managed to get that through. But absolutely, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, really, it's blinking amber, and something has got to give. And I think there has to be some kind of renegotiation on some of these debts that we're holding.
All right, Ali Khan, finally, we're back to it. This is now Kenya going to ask the IMF for an exceptional access, as it were. You again said that you believe it will be granted, maybe not up to the level that Kenya is asking for, but overall, this is the path that Kenya seems left to toe, particularly in the economic situation of things. Lessons learned in this. Do you think Kenya has learned any lessons from this situation? Because even last year, we spoke about the fact that Kenyans were massively against going to the IMF because of the austerity measures that the fund wanted to be put in place. Are we learning lessons so that Kenyans don't find themselves back into this cycle in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
You know, I think we have quite a long-serving, deep bench in terms of policymakers, in terms of the civil service. I think they've learnt the lesson. But, you know, the problem is it's not necessarily them who need to learn the lesson, it's our politicians. And in William Ruto's case, you know, he was in government but not in office in the last administration, and he's inherited these challenges. So, I mean, in that way, one can't point the finger at him. And he's trying to do his level best. But I think if we look at the bigger picture, it's high time our politicians understood when money is cheap, make use of that money, invest it wisely, don't just go and blow it. And that's the lesson I think Africa has got to learn. If we're not going to repeat what we've gone through now.
All right, Ali Khan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst, as well as the CEO of Rich Management. It's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. We're going to go on a quick timeout now. We have international business headlines coming your way, then a conversation about the rising incidences of fraud because more and more Nigerians are getting involved in the mobile money market. You stay with us.